All right, perfect. So again, I think, Misty, just to kind of recap, what we're doing here, I think the idea is just to give you really more of like a conceptual overview of each of these modules, and then I think as cores indicate interest, I think that we can go ahead and dig deeper as need be, but I think it's good to kind of give you an overview here. So the studies module can be a bit confusing because it is like an auxiliary layer above and beyond our service and project-based functionality that exists in that base suite. But when you think about studies, you can really think about it as it's allowing a core to have a layer above and beyond service requests and events. And it allows for tracking individual activity across a project that typically expands over time. So it's kind of like an onion, and it's just like an additional layer that Ilab offers you here. But the root outcome is really that it's going to allow you to handle requests for study process separately from any of the other requests that are going on in those cores. So we'll just quickly look at kind of the overview here, but I talked a little bit about this. Obviously, we're looking at long-running projects and the ability to work, day-to-day tasks into these longer-running projects. And the real important questions that I think any cores that you have that are considering this, first of all, if they're a clinical core, studies is likely going to be something that they're going to want to look at just based on having the word clinical in their core, or if that's something they're looking at. But if any of these questions, and I won't read these out, but as folks are reviewing this recording, if you're looking at these questions and some of these are jumping out at you, then you definitely should consider studies in addition to that base suite functionality. We'll walk through this a bit here, but this is just the kind of the flow of how studies works within Ilab. So it starts with the project or study being initiated by the lead PI. You guys obviously have a full financial integration in place, so that lead PI is also going to carry his or her relevant funding information. You're going to fill out the forms and data along the way. The facility is going to review and configure the project and study in accordance with really what they're looking to do. And then Ilab is going to track the start dates, financial data protocols, and all those types of things. Once that's been set up within Ilab, that's when the request and reservation management can occur. And then obviously once everything's wrapped up and completed, that's when the billing portion would start. So that's really high level. I'm not going to go through these screenshots because I'd rather just jump into the environment for you here. And so here we go. Obviously, it's going to look like any other Ilab setup for you guys. As you know, we're a tab-based system here, so I won't go into the about or schedule or the request services because Misty, hopefully the cores that would be using this or you yourself are already familiar with how these work and how they interface. Obviously, if someone were completely new to Ilab, we'd be more than happy to walk through that more in depth. But just know that when it comes to studies, this is really where you're going to be living at the study initiation tab. That's where the meat and potatoes of this really lives. So I'm not sure if you guys have seen Publication Tracker or some of our other modules, but this one, the view here is somewhat similar in the sense that it's going to store all of the ongoing studies that you have in place, along with applicable statuses, approval levels, the lead coordinator, the lead PI, and just the name here. We'll actually go ahead and initiate a study in a second, but I just wanted to call out what one looks like that's actually already been completed and set up in the system, just to give you that view before we actually go forward with the template. So this actually is one of our newer looking UIs. You can see here on the left-hand side, it's going to categorize the sections of the study that you can build out. As we move through to the actual initiation stage here, you'll notice that some of the sections can be turned on or off, and I'll do my best to call those out. We also have Audrey on here as well, and she may be able to step in as needed if I either make a mistake or maybe I miss something. She'll have that ability to technically speak to some of those here. But just know that like many parts of Ilab, a lot of this can be turned on and off depending on what you're looking to do and the data that you're looking to collect. So obviously we're going to have a little summary section here. You can decide, a lead principal investigator, a lead coordinator. Additionally, you can include other research members. So maybe they're not, either the PI or the lead coordinator, but they do have some role within this study. You can include them there. The purpose of the project, this is obviously a test environment, so Bond determined to keep it very broad, anticipated budget, and those types of things. When we go down to this approval checklist, again, we'll show you this in the initiation stage, but this doesn't necessarily determine if it's approved. It's more in order to be approved, these are the questions that we're going to ask you here. These top three are typically the most, they resonate the most with our clients. This one a little less so, but again, we would have those all checked off. And other than that, I think I'll jump to the initiation here, but it's just going to give you anticipated start dates. I mentioned the other research folks involved. We do have the ability to have fields here. So fields are a bit different than forms. I think you're obviously familiar with custom forms. The difference here is you can actually write in these fields, and you can kind of ask questions, what's the purpose? And then, in this mock environment, we just said, the purpose is solution B, C, or D, but obviously you could adjust this this question here, the text here, and then also the drop-down selections for your folks. We get to the subjects field here. This is where, again, we're going to ask some questions. It's going to depend a lot on what the study is actually looking to study. But, will human subjects be involved? Will it be tracked in iLab? This is when PHI info can come up. So, Misty, I think if we do end up having a clinical core that has PHI relevant info contained, we're going to have to probably have a conversation offline of, how iLab works with PHI info, and what mechanisms, whether that's like a contract or some type of agreement we would need to have in place to make sure, we're crossing all the appropriate ducks off there. This cost analysis is really great. It's going to show you, the summary of the project, the anticipated cost per request, and then the total cost. But again, this one's fairly blank. As you would have a more composed study over a spanning time, you can imagine this progress bar would, fill up accordingly. All this type of data would have a lot more numbers associated to them, and you're going to be able to see, how your cost is allocating versus the number of visits that have occurred. And then additionally, you can add in all these data links and commentary once a study's been set up. So let's take a step back and actually initiate one so you can kind of see what that process would look like for you guys. And again, I'm going to do my best to walk through what functionality can be turned on or off, because I know some of this will be applicable and others won't be. So I think it's important to know those types of things. Feeling a bit lazy? Yeah, no, definitely.
Is that turned off in general, or turned off like temporarily while you're working this section, or is that turned off like for just this study?
So yeah, like let me I'll show you an example actually. Hold on here, okay. So if we go to this unique study identifier, this is where you would include like a de-identifier or like a code. If you guys are using PHI and you kind of want to just put like, this pertains to a person. Obviously, I have no idea what that means, but maybe it's Joe Smith. That's a section where if it's relevant, you can keep it. But if you think it's just going to become, daunting, or it's just going to confuse people, you can actually like turn it off. So when I say like you can toggle them on and off, might be a better way to phrase that. Like they're not going anywhere and they're tied at a study level. So if like you had another study, you could obviously use this. But if you didn't want it here, if we went into the admin section, you could actually remove that. That's all I mean when I say that. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Cool.
So we'll start here in the summary section. If you guys are familiar, with typical workflow of iLab within like the view all requests and creating projects and services, it's going to flow fairly similarly. I mean, I'm not going to go into too much depth here, but obviously for the project title, you would associate something that resonates and makes sense and is based on what you guys are looking to do. I may have clicked something there. Obviously, you can include your anticipated budget, the unique identifier. This is where it's going to toggle your already existing integration with the folks that are accessing your lab and core. So we're going to grab, the lead PI. And I mentioned earlier, when it grabs that lead PI, it's also going to pull the funding source. So all the funding is going to go through that lead PI. So when you do initiate the study, you're going to want to make sure that you're picking the person who's really leading the charge from a funding standpoint. And additionally, you can include the coordinators, and the PI and the coordinators are the ones who are really going to have the power when it comes to utilizing the functionality within studies. Similar to including descriptions on, your core facilities or just some of the service offerings that you guys are doing. Obviously, we can include the purpose of the project. You can include, as little or as much detail as you'd really like there. It's completely up to you guys. And then we get to this anticipated start date. Obviously, when you're thinking about starting, when you're thinking about it's going to end, and then obviously once you complete that, it will show the distinction between the two. So if you had an anticipated start date of April 5th, but it turns out you weren't able to get going until the 18th, these are just anticipations. These aren't set in stone. It's going to pull the fund number again to this PI, and additionally that financial sponsor there. We talked about the fields, so purpose, solution A, B, C. These are customizable. You can determine, what the purpose of your actual, what you'd actually want to include here. It doesn't necessarily have to be purpose. It can really be anything, and it's completely configurable. Actually, and I forgot to mention, I wanted to be pointing out which sections you could turn off. So the summary section can be turned off. So if you don't want to include a summary, you don't have to. And then the field section is configurable, but I do believe that one needs to stay there. If you have other research folks, so I know that obviously we talked about the lead PI and the lead investigator and the coordinator. If you have other folks that are going to be involved here, so maybe they're just users or what have you, you can list all the research members here. This is great because it just further bolsters that collaborative capabilities that iLab has. So similar to when you're working on a service or project, all the members of the team here are going to be able to at least view the study. They may not have all the same privilege levels. Obviously, iLab is set up in a role-based privilege way, but they are going to be able to at least see everything that's going on with the study, and you can email comments to the rest of the team. So this is helpful for keeping communications going, whether you're doing blood draws or what have you. You can make sure everyone's kind of on the same page there. Not sure if this would be relevant to you guys, but if there are outside contacts, meaning whether that's commercial, corporate, government, whatever, if you want to include them as well, obviously you can do that too. In the form section here, and the form section it's more available once the study has been completed. You can actually attach Ilab Forms here. So these forms can live on the study level, or they can be added to every request a user makes. And then also on the study level, they'll be ported through and filled out format for future service requests. So these can be integrated into that service request functionality. So the subjects here, obviously we can toggle these on or off depending on if you guys would actually be looking at human subjects. But if you do toggle it on, it's going to have a bunch of associated text fields that it's going to ask. This is again where we'll have to be a little bit tricky if we're talking about PHI info, and we could obviously have that discussion as applicable. But just do know there are ways that iLab is able to kind of maneuver around PHI, but as a general rule of thumb, we don't usually like to house it. I think it's probably a shared interest, and we do that for compliance reasons and other reasons. But if it does seem like it's something that we will be messing around with PHI, we can go ahead and slot that conversation for another time. Obviously, your study will likely have a protocol associated to it, so you can insert the protocol name here, and then a brief overview of what that protocol entails, the start date and end date of it, its approval status, right? So you can adjust if it's not yet been submitted, pending the board approval, approved, or not available because you're not actually looking at humans. So these are fields that, again, as applicable, a lot of them can be turned off, and we can, obviously we'll work with folks like Audrey and your associated IA to make sure that we're really building this out in a way that makes the most sense for your course. So we continue moving down here. Obviously, you can just include an attachment. So you can include attachments here. You can also include them at other stages when you're doing service-based work or what have you. Like many forms and modules within iLab, that you just have the ability to attach documents as appropriate. This cost analysis section is really interesting. It's going to allow you to basically look at, and I think we saw on the last screen, it's that bar that we showed. It's kind of like a nice visual of where you're at in the study. So you can see your anticipated cost versus your total and kind of where things are at. This is helpful as a lot of these studies will progress over years of time. So it's really helpful to kind of get that visual behind what you're looking at. But again, you can toggle that one on or off depending on what you're looking for. We talked about the approval checklist. I want to make sure, again, we call out that, this section doesn't necessarily say this is the PI or the core admin approving this. Rather, this is just more like internal reference points. Has this protocol been applied? Okay, great. Has the funding been received? Nice. Is the project feasible? And then so on and so forth. So this is a nice little approval checklist that prior to, being marked as, ready to go, you'd want to make sure you fill that out. And then obviously you can include little notes here. Important date section. This is just, maybe the date submitted, date approved, those types of things. And then data links will be available once the study has actually, I've gone ahead and hit submit. And then also like a little note section will pop up as well, excuse me. So again, we're really just looking at, what you can insert into this study. But the important piece here is that within Ilab, this is really just like an above and beyond functionality that allows you to further collaborate, and is really useful for clinical folks that are looking at, blood draws and studies over long spans of time. Because essentially, if you were to do a normal request service, you may, close that one out, versus a study, you can essentially have these services and these requests that are going on over long periods of time that don't need to be closed out. And so again, that's really where, it comes in handy. But all the other fields, like, the view all requests and such, they're going to feel similar and function the same way. It's just everything is really stemmed from and rooted in this previous screen here at the study level. So I'll take a quick second there to maybe ask if there's any questions based on what I described. I think this is one of those modules where it's really helpful to have someone on the other end that kind of has an idea of what the study they're looking to do is, and then we can kind of more walk through, how that we would map that into Ilab, because as you can see, there's a lot of fields that can be filled out. But in terms of functionality, I hope that gives you a little bit of understanding of what it can do and can't do.
Thank you. It does, I guess, you're right. It does help when there are folks on the call who are doing studies currently. But I think, this is definitely giving us a good flavor. That approval checklist, is that configurable?
Yeah, Audrey, if you're on the call, I want to say those are defaulted. I'm not 100%. I don't think it is quite yet, but I think it's something that may be. I don't know if Audrey, if you're still on here, if you can weigh in there.
Those are unfortunately hard-coded in. I'm not sure if they are looking at making those a little bit more configurable for version 2 of studies.
Thank you.
And actually, Misty, just to give you a little bit more background here, as kind of Audrey just noted there, this is obviously version 1. We've had this out, I'm not really sure exactly for how long, but I do know that version 2 is kind of looming right around the corner, and it's being built in accordance with a lot of asks from our existing client base. We essentially showed this to them. They said, yeah, it's great, it does certain things well, but there are some gaps, and we're working on addressing those gaps. And I think Peter and some of the other folks that are leading the charge are really excited about what version 2 will entail. So maybe there's a world where once that's completed, we can obviously update this to show you a more robust look at like where we're at today.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? And then another side note, maybe Audrey, if you feel like I missed anything or want to specifically call anything out, by all means, feel free to. I won't take offense.
Oh, no problem, Rick. I did want to say, I'm not entirely sure. Well, this might be something new that you're aware of that I'm not. As far as turning off those sections, I think it is pretty limited in what we can turn on and off, such as we can turn off the subject sections and the cost analysis section. But most of those aren't required fields. Really, all you have to fill out when you're submitting a study is the lead PI and the full study title. So if you don't want to use that summary section, you can ignore it. You don't have to use the new unique study identifier, or if you have a specific name for an ID, that is actually a field where we can rename that unique study identifier. Maybe it's called, I don't know, the Penn State ID, PID. We could rename that field PID for you. So that's just the only thing off the top of my head that I wanted to add.
Thank you.
And I didn't specifically call this out, but I think another thing I'll note here is if we go up here to the schedule equipment tab, this does work a little bit differently in studies. Essentially, I think how your normal flow would work is obviously you have all of your instrumentation rooms or personnel loaded into that tab, and then they just essentially, mark time against it, and that's how the reservation occurs. When we're talking about studies, that reservation actually will occur at the service request level, and I can show you that quick, but essentially we would open up a service request, which is going to grab the appropriate equipment that's going to be tied to the study. And you'll notice here, like all the ones that we would see in our initiation, like blood draws, imaging, they're going to be here. And when you hit initiate request, and again, it's going to ask us, obviously, okay, hold on, who we're doing the work for. We'll grab a little fake person here quickly. And then the important piece here, as it relates to the schedule equipment, is you're actually going to do this at the add event level. So this is something that, again, as we would train you, there are a couple like little variances between like the regular workflow, but it's just like interesting that you do actually book the instrument here. So that way it's properly associating it to that study. So I wanted to call that one out too.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, if there aren't any other questions, I mean, that's really the high level of it. I think if someone who's viewing this is seeing those fields and thinking that, looking at those 3 questions, this may be something they want to further look at, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to Misty or myself so we can more, fine-tunedly go through your workflow and how that would look. But I think hopefully this gives you a good understanding of just the difference there and what the fields look like and those types of things. And again, all of this, the reporting, billing, all those types of things, it's all going to be the same. It's just, we're working out of the study initiation tab.
Okay.